From a priority perspective, these are twofold. In the energy sector, and consistent with the bank's 10-year strategy and what we call the New Deal on Energy for Africa strategy, which we adopted in 2016, my complex's priority is primarily to accelerate Africa's energy access sustainably. That is anchoring access to renewables through both centralized and decentralized solutions. Secondly, another key priority, and this relates to the climate change and green growth nexus, is to mainstream climate change and green growth considerations into all bank operations, while mobilizing adequate climate finance to support Africa's transition to net zero, while at the same time strengthening the adaptive capacities and resilience in accordance with the Paris Agreement. Based on these two priorities, the bank is also focusing on developing new policies, the first of which is what is the new climate change and green growth policy and policy and strategic framework that will underpin an ambitious plan for the bank's Paris alignment. We expect this framework to be approved before COP26. And in turn, this particular framework will inform or will constitute the foundation of the African Development Bank's review of its energy policy, which we are about to begin. At a macro level, we are all aware of the impacts of the COVID crisis. The first, the continent experienced the first recession in 25 years, resulting in the continent's GDP shrinking by 2.1% in 2020. It is also reported that foreign direct investments to Africa declined by about 18% during 2020. But however, focusing on the energy sector per se, the economic slowdown occasioned by different levels of lockdowns resulted in, amongst others, the following impacts on the energy sector in Africa. The first, which was the most prevalent, was the reduction in the overall energy demand. In the case of oil, resulting in the collapse of oil price and occasioning significant fiscal pressures on major producers such as Algeria, Angola, and Nigeria. While power demand reduced by between 10 to 25%, accentuating financial difficulties of already weak power utilities. Secondly, another impact was the eroded ability of consumers to pay for their consumption, once worsening the revenue base of utilities and further compromising their financial performance. As a result, after 7 years of consecutive increased access, 2020 experienced a reduction in energy access, with 30 million access to modern energy on account of COVID. In simply put, they could no longer afford electricity. Then, of course, there were delays in development and commissioning of projects affected by disruption in the supply chains. What all this means is that in the post-COVID era, enhancing electricity access will remain a priority for Africa, especially if universal access to electricity is to achieved soon. And further, that we should use the pandemic, in my view, as a form of reset to accelerate Africa's transition to low carbon pathway by using the continent's immense and largely untapped renewable sources of energy. So in my view, therefore, considering that there are huge demands on the resources that need to be mobilized at the scale and rate that is required For example, IEA projects that under what they call the Sustainable Development Scenario, that up to $100 billion per year will be required to meet energy demand between 2020 and 2040. This is huge by whatever stretch of imagination, especially considering the dwindling public financing in addition to the extra fiscal burden that has been imposed or will be required for post-COVID recovery efforts. And this suggests that greater private sector involvement in the power sector is an absolute imperative. And therefore, I foresee greater role for private sector in generation, which is well established already, but additionally in distribution, as well as transmission system development and operation. I think the first thing is that governments must institute cost-reflective tariffs. This is because the tariffs will enhance the financial viability of power sectors, including the utilities. This will, in so doing, the governments will boost the financial capacity of the utilities and therefore enable them to meet their obligations, whether it is to pay for bulk supply from generators, meet transmission and distribution expansion, upgrade and maintenance requirements, or indeed invest in customer billing systems. However, it is not all about cost-reflective tariffs. There are a number of structural deficiencies that will need to be resolved. And these include creating enabling legal and regulatory frameworks. This is because it is widely acknowledged that regulatory reforms that result in credible, predictable, and stable regulatory regimes are fundamental to attracting private sector investment that would enhance adequacy, reliability, and security of generation, and indeed also improve the capacity of the transmission and distribution systems. Also, there are other things that the government needs to do. The government needs to address the capacity constraints that they have. And these capacity constraints lead to few bankable projects and results in protracted negotiations of projects and financing agreements. I am a firm believer that well-structured projects, complemented by transparent and predictable procurement process, will always attract high caliber investments, both in equity and debt. Countries must therefore build or acquire the requisite capacity to generate well-structured projects, and then tender or auction them to credible and transparent procurement processes, and create an environment that fosters efficient development. Efficient development, in this case, what I mean is obtaining licenses, approvals, and permits of these projects for greater private sector participation in the sector. I would say there are about 3 or 4 very important infrastructure trends that we are seeing. The first of which, and I believe is the most significant, is the recent trend in the dramatically declining cost of renewable energies, especially solar and wind. As a result, renewable generation, or what I call new renewable generation, has become cost competitive compared with conventional sources of energy. Indeed, subject to addressing their variability or intermittence, the potential for these sources is almost infinite, which leads to the next important trend. And this is the affordability of battery energy storage systems. This, in my view, will be a game changer especially regarding establishing what we call the green baseload, both for off-grid and on-grid electrification. From an electricity access perspective, and this shows the importance of this trend, the declining cost of solar has enabled rural electrification through distributed renewable energy solutions, for example, solar home systems, mini grids, and off-grid systems, to the extent hitherto unimaginable. Indeed, IEA again projects that over 50% of new electricity connections by 2030 will be from DRE solutions. This, therefore, should be an area of tremendous interest to investors. Another important trend is the opening of the development of transmission infrastructure to the private sector, which was hitherto the preserve of governments on the premise that transmission was a natural monopoly and therefore less amenable to private financing. Considering the amounts of generation that we will require to evacuate to meet Africa's development needs, I foresee a big opportunity for investors in transmission infrastructure development, including regional interconnectors that will facilitate power trade. Lastly, I also like the trend in designing of programmatic approaches, such as South Africa's renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, which has resulted in 6,300 megawatts of capacity being procured in 102 projects over 4 bidding rounds, and with another 14,000 under tender. And a similar approach was employed in Egypt's Benba Solar Park, and also in Morocco's Nour plan, which aims to develop 4,000 megawatts. These programs are premised on well-structured, standardized project agreements to minimize project development periods and costs. I must state here that the bank will apply similar approach in the 11 countries to develop the 10 gigawatts of solar generation capacity as part of the bank's Desert to Power initiative. The bank's focus on grid and off-grid investments is very deliberate. And it is informed by the fact that there are parts of our countries where it will be almost impracticable to supply power using the grid, using grid extensions for a very long period of time. They would be simply prohibitively expensive. Then emerges affordable solar technology, complemented by cellular-based prepayment platforms that make DRE feasible. As stated earlier, it is projected that more than 50% of new connections by 2030 will be through DRE, as Africa harnesses its 10 terawatts of solar potential, of which less than 1% has been exploited to date. It is actually because of the transformational nature of DRE and the huge solar resource that is available in Africa that the bank has been at the forefront of the mini grid agenda in Africa and proactively addresses ways of scaling up and rolling out mini grid scale-up programs. Hence, as you sort of intimated, the bank established what we call the Green Mini Grid Market Development Program through the $275 million, what we call SEFA, Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, and the provision of financing through what we call the Facility for Energy Inclusion, FEI, another fund for $500 million, which provides specialized debt to off-grid and grid-based solar home systems, mini grids, IPPs, and commercial and industrial projects. Now, as far as Essor is concerned, this now becomes what I would call the test of the pudding. Here is a situation whereby the bank is participating in this particular project, and the aim and what we foresee as the potential outcomes from this project are: number one, to demonstrate new DRE-based business model involving the private sector. I do believe this is the first large-scale mini-grid project on the continent that AFDB will be investing in on a project finance basis that can be replicated at scale. This is very important. Being able to replicate it at scale is vitally important. Secondly, a significant outcome of this particular project is that we expect it to contribute to mitigating the energy access deficit in DRC, one of the countries with the lowest energy access rates globally. And finally, another important outcome of the Essor project is that we want to showcase the transformative capacity of blended financing through concessional resources from the likes of Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa and the Green Climate Fund in structuring viable privately financed DRE projects. The IPP model, under its various designs, such as build, own, and operate, or build, own, or operate and transfer, has actually served very well in providing much needed generating capacity that has helped Africa avoid rolling blackouts and indeed provided power for economic development. The model has also played an important role in the development of renewables. In my view, however, more needs to be done to entrench and establish more effective regulatory frameworks at the country level, which could in turn be harmonized at regional level. Additionally, governments and development partners must work together in a coordinated approach to facilitate the structuring of more bankable and larger projects that can facilitate regional trade. The generation capacity must be evacuated to the load centers. This is important. And in this regard, the IEA estimates that about $51 billion of investment will be needed every year between 2019 and 2040 in grid expansion, reinforcement, and maintenance to reach universal access by 2030. Considering countries' fiscal constraints and the competing needs for national budgets, including post-COVID-19 recovery measures, the participation of private sector transmission and distribution in transmission and distribution infrastructure is therefore inevitable. However, again, in my view, further legal and regulatory reforms will be required in the power sector. For example, a law has to be made to allow private transmission system operators. And in some cases, there might be need to create independent system operators. We have to see which operating models and revenue models work best. Is it wheeling or fixed availability payments akin to IPPs? We will need to consider all this, while the principles of equitable sharing of risks, like in IPPs, will need to be safeguarded. Finally, credible, stable, predictable regulatory environments will be fundamental to the success of independent transmission systems. Africa is indeed a very minor emitter of greenhouse what do you call this? greenhouse gas emissions, contributing only 3% of historical global emissions. However, this will not be the case forever. And this is because rising incomes, urbanization, as well as industrialization is expected to combine to push electricity demand to at least double by 2040. And there has been fears that this could occasion increased emissions. Fortunately, though, and subject to addressing variability of wind and solar, the increased demand could actually be met using Africa's enormous renewable resources, including 10 terawatts of solar potential, 350 gigawatts of hydroelectric potential, 110 gigawatts of wind potential, an additional 50 gigawatts of geothermal potential, the bulk of which remains untapped. This will, however, require commensurate increase in transmission and distribution capacity, including regional interconnections, to evacuate the additional renewable generation and facilitate export and trading excess renewable generation, thereby enhancing resilience to climate change and diversifying the sources of energy. Additionally, the combination of national and regional transmission systems can also contribute to reduced variability of renewable generation capacity by facilitating access to efficient spinning reserves, for example, from neighboring countries, and taking advantage of locational differences in demand due to time zones, weather conditions, and general complementarities in energy resources. It is therefore obvious that transmission and indeed distribution infrastructure will be integral to Africa's net zero transition.